Today on Yeti at Large, letters from a United States Marine Sergeant, Pacific Theater of Operations, World War II.
This is Yeti at Large, a channel focused on making the most out of what you got, no matter where you're at. Now that you're here, let's go.
This is the second and requested installment of our feature of Sergeant Kempton, a United States Marine Corps Sergeant in the Pacific Theater of Operations in World War II. So we were entrusted with this folder from Sergeant Kempton's family member. It had a couple of photographs of him in his uniform, which we featured on the channel. It had his DD-214, but back then it was considered a different form, and it had his honorable discharge. But what interested us most is that in this folder, it had a series of letters that he wrote, not as a soldier in a foxhole from the battlefield in the fog of war, but years later. The first letter are things I learned in the Marine Corps. After that, he wrote a story of Guadalcanal. These are first-hand experiences. Then he wrote about a Christmas crisis from Guadalcanal. He wrote 4 Days of Carnage, talking about the landings at Tarawa. He also wrote about Thanksgiving immediately following Tarawa. After that, he had a letter that's titled Dear Mr. President, but it ended up being directed to his children and his family members. And finally, in October of the year 2000, he wrote to the Veterans Affairs requesting help getting hearing aids. I included this one because I think it's very relevant for any vet who's had to deal with the VA and ongoing medical issues. We're going to read these letters verbatim. Some of the language may seem dated. I can assure you there isn't a mean, hateful, or racist bone in Sergeant Kempton's body. His grammar, his syntax, his penchant for run-on sentences remind me very much of myself. Makes it difficult to read them. I'm not reading these letters with an intent to be artistic or put some style on them. I'm trying to read them verbatim. But I wanted to be as accurate and honest and represent his writings exactly as he put them down. So they might be a little rough in a few spots. But bear with us. These are a first-hand, accurate account of a soldier's experiences, many times years downrange after he's had a time to reflect on those experiences. What makes these letters so valuable is these represent the residue, the things that he thinks about years later, what he remembers most. His heart pours out for his fellow Marines, even the Japanese soldiers that he faced. Understand that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do learn from history are doomed to watch those who didn't. I believe that was an Athenian general, Thucydides, that quoted that about 2,500 years BC. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. There'll be some links and more information in the description to help you follow up and do more research of your own. Please, share this channel and this video with friends and family and people that might be interested. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us continue telling these stories. And if you know of anybody from any era in history that has a compelling story to tell, we'd love to share it. Please reach out to us. We'd love to connect with folks and tell some of their story as well. Thank you.
Things I learned in the Marine Corps. The first thing I learned in the Marine Corps was that they hated civilians. They hate your hair, your clothes, your debonair attitude, your language, and your independent ways. By the end of the first day, they have destroyed that protective culture your mama gave you and introduced you into a foreign, brutal, demanding culture that destroys your independence and molds you into a unit that does everything together, whenever and wherever you are told. However, the Marine Corps is at least a very religious institution. I remember very well our drill instructor told us that we should give our souls to Jesus because our ass belongs to him. Number 1. Actually, the training that you get in the Marines is invaluable if you just don't buck the system. Keep in mind that the Marines have been doing this for a long time, and they know what it takes to turn boys into men and men into a fighting force for our country. Be honest about it. Most young men are spoiled by their loving parents, have developed bad habits, and mom and dad have made their beds, carried out their garbage, washed and ironed their clothes, given them an allowance, if not a car, and they have all kinds of freedom, which they did not always use well. But in the Marine Corps, everything they do has a good reason, even if you can't see it. So don't buck it, but do exactly as you're told, and you will find it will go very well with you. But if you don't, punishment will follow disobedience, but prompt obedience will produce rewards and valuable skills. About taking your clothes and learning to shoot. Number 2, beware of old Marine slogans like, "You volunteered once, you'll never volunteer again." Volunteering is the lifeblood of the Corps. That's where we find our leaders, and that can lead to a commission. I was a buck private when I landed on Guadalcanal, and was certainly not thinking about getting a commission. But I heard that there was a need to take ammunition ashore and bring wounded back. So I jumped into a Higgins boat. I jumped out on the beach under fire, delivered the ammo, and then took a boat full of wounded back to the ship 3 times. I volunteered to do recon on Florida Island to get rid of Jap listening posts. I volunteered to relieve 1st Division troops on the Metiancao River. I also volunteered to take depleted radios ashore so we could direct our fire from our supporting ships. In fact, I was always thinking about what and how we could do to secure our positions and counterattack the Jap charges night after night on Saipan. The result was that I went from a buck private to a platoon sergeant after 27 months overseas. Back in the States, I was offered an opportunity to get a commission at Quantico, just because I had been recommended by my company commander. On Tarawa, there were PFCs leading what was left of a company. Never ask why me. Instead, say let me. Number 3, never condemn another service. We used to look down on our swabby friends. We used to call them paint chippers, and we would point out how soft they had it. 3 good meals a day, no hiking, a clean worn bunk at night, no foxholes. Boy, did they have it made. Yes, until their ship goes down, and their ships go down when they stand between us and the Jap fleet. At Guadalcanal, 4 heavy cruisers lost, facing a formidable Jap naval force. We had to pick them out of the water. The Navy were our taxis, and they saved our butts many times. It was the Army that relieved us 3 months after landing and brought badly needed supplies. We are not trained to fight our American forces, but the enemies. Number 4. Finally, guard your moral and spiritual life. This may be the most difficult thing you will do when you are young, away from home, and are subject to many temptations you would not entertain if you were home. When I was just out of boot camp stationed at Camp Pendleton, an old gunnery sergeant, knowing how green I was, decided that he was going to introduce me to the temptations of the flesh. He said, "Kempton, we're going to make you into a good Marine. We are going to get you stewed, screwed, and then tattooed." But I said, "If that's what it takes to be a good Marine, then I don't think I ever will make it, Gunny." When we got ready to leave the States, we got one last liberty in San Diego because we were already aboard our troop ship and ready to sail. And knowing as they did, the corpsmen had a medical station set up at the top of the gangplank so that as Marines returned to the ship, they would have to have an injection in their penis to keep them from getting a venereal disease once we were out at sea. The orders were that every man, without exception, would have to subject themselves to this procedure. I considered this to be an invasion of my privacy, and I insisted that I had not been with the woman and was certainly not going to submit to this kind of presumption. The naval officer of the deck said he had orders to disinfect every man, and if I did not submit to it, I would be arrested and thrown in the ship's brig. I said, "Okay, let's go to the brig." But about that time, my platoon leader, Captain Johnson, came up, and when he saw my dilemma, he thought it was hilarious, and he laughed and laughed. And then he said to the deck officer, "I will vouch for Kempton that he has not been with a woman." So the deck officer let me go, but you can believe the rest of the platoon did not let me forget that virtuous protestation. Most of the venereal diseases the Marines picked up was contracted after they had been drinking, and were not capable of making intelligent decisions. And the same can be said for those who made regrettable decisions to get tattooed. Tattoos reflect a poor image, as they though lacked self-esteem or wanted to look tough and salty, so they got tattooed, and most of them regretted making their bodies into a billboard. Servicemen often received free cigarettes and were not as aware of the deadly consequences of cigarettes today. But when we were deposited on Guadalcanal in Tulagi, we were not able to get cigarettes for over 3 months, and they were shooting snipes on the ground, taking them apart, rolling them up with newspaper, and smoking them. The smokers really suffered until they could get more cigarettes. Occasionally, a Navy ship would dock in Tulagi's harbor and come ashore with duffel bags full of cartons of cigarettes, which they would trade for Jap souvenirs. So some of our guys would file the numbers and letters off of the little worthless rising submachine gun and tell the swabbies they were Jap guns, and they would also shoot our .45 ammunition. One of the guys traded one of these fake guns for about 20 cartons of cigarettes. The desire for alcohol was pitiful. I have seen Marines drink Aqua Velva and other alcoholic face lotions. 2 Marines discovered that a Jap torpedo that was stored on Tulagi had alcohol in it. They siphoned it out and drank it. They did not know it was wood alcohol. One man died, and the other man screamed all night in pain, lost his sight, and had to be sent home. One of my closest buddies got malaria, like I did from being on Guadalcanal. But when we were sent down to New Zealand, I got over it after a couple of bad fevers. My buddy didn't, because every weekend when he got liberty, he would go into Wellington and get drunk. But every time he got drunk, he would also have another siege of malaria, and finally had to be sent to a hospital in Hawaii that was just like a prison, so he could not drink anymore, because his malaria almost turned into black water fever, which goes up the spine to the brain and finally kills you. It has been my observation that the young Marine's worst enemy is not another foreign nation. It is his inability to control his moral life so that he ends up sick, injured, in a fight, a car accident, or devastated by venereal disease, or prone to being AWOL, or to function responsibly in his duties. The strength and insight to live morally and productively is the byproduct of a faith in a living God, and you have to have that faith stimulated and activated. You must avail yourself of the services of worship that a chaplain or a local church provides. When we wanted to know how to perform as a Marine, we used to turn to the Marine Bible. When we want to know how to perform as a moral soldier, then we turn to God's Word. Without that direction, we risk malfunctioning as a Marine and as a moral person. The day after we left Tarawa was Thanksgiving Day. What was left of our regiment, including the walking wounded, departed on one ship. Although it took 3 ships to bring our regiment to Tarawa, the deck of our ship was covered with the walking wounded who were not able to navigate the stairways to go to the mess hall. So we were instructed over the PA system for every able-bodied man to go down and bring a tray of food up to one of the walking wounded and help feed them if necessary until all of the walking wounded were fed. I made 3 trips to the mess hall before all the men had been fed and had to go down a 4th time to get some turkey for myself. The ship's sick bay was filled with the seriously wounded, so the repercussions of the 4-day battle were constantly before us wherever we went. A chaplain gave a prayer of thanks to God for the victory and for the healing of those that were left, but the morale of the troops was low, and we remembered the friends and comrades that had been left behind on Tarawa. It was not hard to think maybe the price had been too high, or that there had been a better way to approach such a formidable fortress. We consoled one another with the knowledge that we had finished the task and were capable of doing what a Marine was supposed to do. Story of Guadalcanal. Dear family, recently Phyllis said that she had read in the paper about the details of battles that soldiers were sending home for their families to enjoy. And she added that she wondered if I had any war stories to tell. I thought you'd never ask. It seemed to me that every Marine be prepared to relate the gruesome details or blood and guts, even if they never experienced combat, since their family and friends expected every Marine to enjoy the pristine joy of shedding blood, if not in battle, then surely in some bar. Actually, most soldiers avert actual battle vigorously, and very few will do it alone. The most common acts of violence are perpetuated in a bar after they have had a few beers and when they think they might make an impression of being a tough guy. But it is surprising what an organization like the Marine Corps can produce. Most of those new to the Corps have just been delivered from his loving parents in high school, and unless they went out for football or wrestling, they have yet to never pay the price of getting in prime physical condition. Boot camp cuts the strings of protective families, and suddenly the boot has to relate to an unforgiving, demanding, brutal, brute who demands perfection in everything you do from 0500 to 2200, who will slap you in the face if you get cocky, make you do 30 push-ups as fast as you can, and if you offer any excuses for anything, he will say, I don't want your excuses, I want your ass. And I want it now. I think you get the idea. When boot camp is over, you are remanded to an infantry company where immediate obedience is again the order of the day. You must make your own bed every day perfectly. If there's a flaw in your blanket, the officer inspecting will grab the covers, rip them off the bed, throw them on the floor, and demand, now make that bunk right. That kind of inspection will become part of everything you do. A perfectly clean rifle, boots, the way you tie your neckerchief, and what they call junk on the bunk. Your lieutenant inspects your bunk, rifle, clothes, and you have the right number of clothes, all to lay out in the bunk in those daily inspections. To fail is to mean no liberty. You stay in camp for a week, you will clean the heads. That is what they call the toilet. In time, you learn to be perfect, and you learn to take pride in being perfect, because you know perfection means that you will learn to do better than the enemy that will soon hope to kill you before you can kill him. Nothing gave me greater pride than the day that I shot a perfect score firing my rifle on the rifle range. They give you a little medal that you can wear, and everyone in the Marine Corps knows what that little medal means. Those who missed getting it had to bear the disgrace of wearing the second-rate medal. The reason for this introduction is to help you understand how important it is for a Marine to strive for perfection. The desire begins in boot camp and follows him into battle, and becomes part of all that he does in the future. So, when a Marine describes his battle as a Marine or as a civilian, he wants to tell it like it was, without shame, fear, but just like it was. And those that question his veracity deny him the right to parade his courage and deny themselves the privilege. I first encountered the ship that I was to cross the Pacific Ocean on, the first liberty I had after boot camp. It was formerly a huge luxury liner, which had to be remodeled from suites to single bunks 4 levels high so as to accommodate more bodies. We made 3 practice landings near La Jolla, and then just before we made a real military landing, we made 3 practice landings on the way, so we were well prepared for the real thing. The Japs were caught completely by surprise, both at Guadalcanal and at Tologi, and withdrew into the far end of Guadalcanal, where they were taken aboard lest they lose all their troops there. What we did encounter was airstrikes while we were trying to put our troops and supplies ashore. One of our ships, the Post, had a bomb drop down its stack and in 4 days sank. Later, while on patrol on Florida Island, I was the right flank patrol leader and spotted something that looked like an old log rolling in and out of the ocean. But the closer I got, the more it looked like a body, and I signaled to the head of our column that I had found a body. When we searched his uniform, he had been dead for 4 days after being blown off his ship, the Post. We discovered that he was the chief petty officer, so we buried him inland, marked his grave, and then sent his identification pictures to Marine headquarters, who in turn sent them to his wife. The second day of the landing, I was helping getting troops and supplies ashore, and putting heavy 3-round artillery load on my back as I walked out on a landing craft, all bent over with the load, and nearly stepped right in the face of a dead Jap soldier who had been killed as a sniper during the night. And it had rained overnight, washing the blood on his pale face, leaving only a little blue hole right in the middle of his forehead. And as I looked down on that very young face, he no longer looked like a frightening enemy, but more like someone's son, who would never know when and where and how their son departed this world. I also could not help but ask, how long will it be before this happens to me? Once secured, we were organizing to send patrols to the larger island of Florida. These were hair-raising expeditions through heavy jungle, wading in the swamps up to our chest at times, and very uncomfortable, for we never knew when we might encounter the enemy, just waiting for us around the next swamp. For you are not in the most favorable situation for a firefight when you are up to your chest in a swamp. That which saved us was a black man who had been born on this island, taken out and sent to Australia for an English education by missionaries. It really sounded funny to hear a naked, wore only a small G-string, speak perfect Australian English, and then in turn jabber something to his own people, and it always sounded like he was giving them hell about something. Without his guidance, we would have been lost for sure. Our black guide was constantly being harassed by one of our Marines. He mimicked the guide's English accent and constantly kept us laughing. The guide threatened to lose him in one of the swamps, and he he would retaliate by saying, "Great, then I wouldn't have to pay my wife any more alimony." The guide shocked us by saying, "You're lucky. You only have one wife, but I have 6. The scenario was always the same. A small patrol of about 12 to 15 Marines, led by a black guide, to camps deep in the forest, yet close enough to survey the incoming ships from the U.S. and send radio messages to waiting Jap airfields to come down to try to sink our supply ships. Once scourged, the air attacks stopped, and supplies could be brought in without any intervention. Being on those patrols kept me out of some of the major battles on Guadalcanal, and I was grateful for that. But when I returned to Tologi, I had heard that the island had been fortified by the small torpedo boats, and they would go out after dark and stalk the large Jap cruisers. But their crews soon became exhausted and asked if some of the Marines would relieve the crews of the torpedo boats. Since we were on a regimental weapons outfit, we were expected to be able to handle these weapons, and we were. So I volunteered to relieve a machine gun operator, and before I knew it, we were cruising out of the harbor at dusk, heading for the huge, overpowering cruisers of the Jap fleet. We didn't dare approach them in daylight, for they had the ability to blow us out of the water with one shot. But at night, we were more maneuverable, and if we could just get one torpedo in them, but the trick was getting close enough, for they had 8-inch guns that could sink us with one shot. So the only way you could hurt them would be through the darkness of night. But after 3 sleepless nights, I gave up and went back to our 37mm anti-tank guns on the west side of Tologi, but we never were tested on that side of the island. Then we were ordered to relieve another 37mm gun outfit that had been operating on Guadalcanal. So we took a boat across the water to relieve another platoon of a 37mm that had been set up right at the crossing of the Metanicao River, but we got so bored waiting for some kind of attack that never came. Soon the river became our playground. Some rigged up a rope and an old tire so that we could swing out over the river and drop in from about 10 feet high. I felt like a kid back on the Des Moines River. About that time, we began to have malaria, or one of the feet infections that make your feet look like they are rotting. And they tried to put some kind of purple medicine on our feet to arrest its spread. But in its worst condition, it could really take you off your feet. I was fortunate that I did not get malaria at that time, because there was little or no medicine for it at that time. My malaria came later, after we left Guadalcanal and retired to New Zealand. By then, they had medicines for both, and my resistance was strong enough to minimize both. But after 6 months on Guadalcanal, fending off night fighters that were no more than a nuisance than they were a danger, we were ordered aboard ship and off to New Zealand. We had not yet completely defeated either malaria or the Japs, or I am sure they had it as bad as we did. We mostly just got sick and went home. About that time, they were able to fly planes in, and they made a base on Guadalcanal, and the Japs, little by little, pulled their forces off Guadalcanal and retired to other Pacific islands closer to home. We had at least stopped the Jap intervention in the Pacific, and the American Army moved in to occupy what we had taken. Little did we know we would soon be fighting another kind of battle. We were moved to New Zealand by ship and resettled at Mackay Crossing. That's a small town where the narrow gauge railroad stopped to pick up the Marines and delivered them to Wellington for liberty every Saturday. Most of the New Zealand men were fighting Germany in North Africa, creating a most timely vacuum for the Marines to fill. 6 months later, their men would return home and create even a bigger war to determine who would occupy the New Zealand women. Our respite in New Zealand was to be short-lived. They gave us about 5 months of R&R and time to get replacements from the States. Our casualties had been much more than battle wounds. Malaria afflicted everyone, some to be sent to a special hospital in the Hawaiian Islands for long-term treatment. From time to time, we all got it over and over again, like a serious flu, but we were badly needed, so we had to just keep up our 6-mile training hikes so that we would be ready for Tarawa. Once ready for Tarawa, we boarded our transport, and once at sea, they could tell us where we were heading. They even gave us photographs of that dinky island, just 2 miles long and about 800 yards wide, but every inch of its shoreline loaded with gunfire, and the interior was just one armed bunker after the other. This island was not supposed to defeat us. They were purposely to kill every Marine they could, and then die for their country. The idea was they were supposed to slow us down down and getting to Tokyo. This beautiful little island was blessed with lovely palm trees, but once our planes and naval guns finished their initial bombardment, it looked like they had been run over by a lawnmower. The only ones alive were those that were in the impervious bunker. We were not to see the whites of their eyes until the bombardment was over and the landing craft were on their ways to shore. Now again, because I was in a regimental weapons company, I escaped being the first wave ashore. Our half-tracks with their 75mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns and tanks would follow. It was just naked riflemen that were dropped into the water up to their armpits that had to walk into that incessant machine gun fire. To this day, I will never understand how any of them got to shore alive. The second day, the few that had made it to the beach held their lines overnight, radioed to our ships, and said they badly needed reinforcements, and they needed more corpsmen to treat the wounded, many of whom had died from their wounds overnight. I had spent the whole day before, and what I could see most of the night and the next day. I was at the rail again, praying for my comrades, and wondering how long it would be before we could get ashore with our heavy equipment. Then I heard the announcement over the PA system. It asked for volunteers to take medical aid, water, and food for rifle support on the lines against the suicidal Japs. This time I didn't wait for permission. I knew my outfit would not go ashore with all of their heavy equipment until they had secured the beach, and I could not wait that long. I jumped into a small boat that was to deliver relief to a small contingent near a 1,500-foot pier that was previously used for taking equipment and supplies ashore, where the shallow water prohibited larger craft. Also, when we got to the end of the pier, it was stacked with all kinds of equipment, food, and medicine, and boxes of ammunition. The coxswain, the guy who drove our boat, dropped our little rescue right at the end of the pier and quickly backed off because he was taking machine gun fire on the steel plate that protected him, and the rest of us took cover behind the huge pile of supplies. The correct spelling of the word coxswain is coxswain, the dictionary says. All I know is that he is one brave sucker to drive this boat so close to shore. The coxswain stood up behind the steel metal shield, and that is all that kept him from dying that day. We kidded the sailors a lot when we were aboard ship, but many of them laid their lives on the line for us, and I still cherish their courageous bravery. By the way, if you want to know how it feels to run down a 1,500-foot pier while under fire, you can go to La Jolla, California, and the pier there is almost identical to the one at Tarawa. I know because I've paced it off, and anytime I go there, I pace off the pier again. All that saved us was the protective fire of the other protective fire south of us. When the Japs stuck their head up to fire at us, they got heavy fire from our buddies. God must have been with us, because only 3 of us were lightly wounded, so we figured that 9 out of 12 who ran it made it. Once ashore, we joined the other company who had also taken heavy casualties, and the result was that we had to join another company, tend to our casualties, and sleep overnight in a quickly dug foxhole made for 2, with sleeping 1 at a time, so that one of us would be awake at all times. We didn't fire a shot that night because we didn't know where everyone was, and we had no attacks from the Japs. Daylight revealed that our lines had held, and we now had the ability of calling in heavy firepower from our warships. Boy, could they ever pinpoint those 14-inch and 16-inch battleship guns, and the little destroyers would run parallel to the island and lamb blast any Jap movement. I almost felt sorry for them. The Japs we had fought almost always preferred to fight at night because they were better snoop and poop fighters. They did seem to see better than we did in the dark, but come daylight, the Marine with the rifle were better shots, and nothing was ever better than a Marine with a bayonet charge. Then it was take no enemies and show no mercy. We just could not afford to trust them to surrender. We took away their aces, eliminated all their choices. The only good Jap was a dead Jap. 4 days of close infighting brought the humiliated Japs into surrendering. Not once did the Japs try to rescue their troops. They were considered expendable. Some were resourceful enough to flee to the north where the tide was down so they could walk north of Tarawa in the knee-deep water to the other small islands. We did not waste time pursuing them. They knew they were lucky to be alive. It took 4 days to secure the island, and then they took us back aboard ship again. The sick bay of the ship was crowded with the wounded, and the walking wounded were all around topside of the ship. We volunteered to go down to the mess hall and get a tray full of food and bring it topside for the wounded, and in some cases feed them, for often their hands and arms would be bandaged. Still others we visited in the sick bays from the ship and fed them from their trays. Even though we had won the battle, it was heartbreaking to see the seriously wounded who could not feed themselves, or who daily died in the sick bay of the ship on the way to Hawaii, not to mention those that had died in Tarawa. Even just on our ship, we buried 5 men at sea. and the chaplains were busy ministering to many others who had not been able to cope with the viciousness of our losses. One chaplain, who was very close to a young sergeant who aided him in our regular services, was found dead, just 20 feet from where the chaplain had taken shelter for the night. Some called this a great victory, but all of those that walked around the deck of the ship, bandaged head, arm in a sling, short one leg, or lying limp in a stretcher on the deck because there's no longer any room in the sick bay, might have said otherwise. I slept on the steel deck under a lifeboat all the way to Hawaii, almost feeling guilty because I had not been wounded. 0. To share in that red badge of courage. Hawaii sounded like heaven, and we couldn't just help cheering as we left the harbor of Tarawa. But the walking wounded were everywhere on the ship because the really damaged wounded were in the sick bay, and we had to take turns going into the mess hall and bringing a dinner on a tray so we could feed those who were hurt. But as depressing as it was to see the wounded, we knew the ship was heading for Hawaii, and where there would be a genuine hospital for the wounded and peaceful rest for those that had survived Tarawa. When we arrived, we were ushered into trucks with canvas covers for a ride to the top of the Big Island. But that warm, blissful air soon to turn cold. We weren't dressed for that. Our camp was 5,000 feet high, and by the time we got there, we were frozen stiff. Tent camps had been set up for us, equipped with 8 beds per tent, and a first-class mess hall had already been prepared for us. After that ice-cold trip, we were ready for a good meal. The best thing you could say about this camp is it looked like Texas. Yes, we had cactus rocks aplenty and space to hike. There were even cattle that were regularly rounded up and taken down to the shore where they could swim the cattle out to a ship, pick them up in a net, and lower them into the bowels of the ship. It became immediately evident that this campsite was not meant to be a rest stop. The closest burg was about 15 miles away, so there would be no beer, although several months later we were allowed a ration of 2 bottles of beer, and when I would not get in line to get the beers for my buddies, I was considered to be a hopeless, worthless scrounger that would come to no good. A month later I was equally denounced because I would not get in line to get my share of free cigarettes. I think the USO was behind that. I would not condone drinking or smoking or a lady of the night because I had to be a witness for my Savior. In my time, most of them forgave me. I think they even respected me. Occasionally, when I was standing guard or along with another Marine, I had opportunities to witness to them, and I found they not only respected my stand, but envied my courage to buck the majority. We were to live 5 months on Hawaii. I never had a liberty. We needed that time to deal with the onslaught of malaria and to have our regular 6-mile hikes, fire our weapons, train with our 37mm anti-tank guns and the 75mm guns mounted on our half-tracks, to be issued new green uniforms. I loved all of the preparations, but dreaded going back into what I knew would be the loss of some of our best men. In the process, we got new recruits, fresh from the States, to replace our wounded and those down with malaria. Then one day the word came, and we mounted our trucks and drove to the harbor, where we loaded the bowel of the ship with our half-tracks with their machine guns. We had used most of our time at the top of the island of Hawaii just training and shooting, but nothing in the way of liberty or freedom. 2 days out of the harbor, we were told that we were going to Saipan was our target, and then Tinian. Both were big islands, and the Japs had spent years preparing to defend this important outpost. 2 days out, I began to feel apprehensive. After all, I was a veteran of Guadalcanal, Tulogi, and Tarawa. What made me think I could continue to survive if I was to purposely place myself in the path of danger? I began to ask, why me again? Why does it have to be my squad, my platoon, my company? So far I had been lucky. But how long can I avoid the necessity of brutal, violent confrontation with those terrifying foreigners? One day, my fears drove me to the upper deck where I could find respite and a place to pray. I knew that if I didn't pray, I would not be able to overcome my fears. I would not be able to perform, to lead, and to function as a competent, bold Marine sergeant. As I had these thoughts, I had also heard just beyond my vision, behind a lifeboat, there was a circle of 6 American Indians off of our reservations for code purposes, sitting cross-legged and singing while pounding on the steel deck. I couldn't understand a word they were singing, but it was obvious this was a worship service, calling on God to give them courage in the face of danger. And out of my tears, I began to pound and pray with them, though they could not hear me. And in God's Spirit flooded my heart and assured me that I would present myself well. If I had to die for their country, then I would respond to that call, just as the Indians were committing theirs. I can honestly say that from that day on I was never afraid of dying, only fearful that I might fall short in doing my duty. And He has answered that prayer. Before I knew it, we were in the harbor at Saipan. By that time, they had all of the cargo emptied, and it was close to the end of the day, and I had a little time to find a place to sleep, but settled into a shallow foxhole just off the beach and went to sleep hoping that we would not be overrun, for we had nowhere to run except into the ocean behind us. I fell asleep from exhaustion and was wakened about 11 p.m. by the sound of a Jap tank heading our way. Then I heard a second tank, and it was obvious their intention was to push us back into the ocean. Then I saw one of our men grab his rocket launcher and 2 rockets and run out into the darkness and waited for the 2 tanks to approach our position. And when one came alongside him, tanks are notoriously blind, and fired a rocket into the side of the tank, killing the 2 tank drivers. He then ran through the darkness to the second tank and repeated his exploit. Took a lot of guts and initiative for an 18-year-old kid to do that in the face of heavily armed tanks. Both were hit, blown up, and set afire. And for that, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's the stuff Marines are made of. The next day, we began to make our way inward, and this time the Army was supposed to move in with us and to take the only airfield on the south end of Saipan. However, when the Army general in charge of taking the airfield failed to complete his mission, the Army was assigned to take the airfield but failed, and then asked why, he replied, "We are being held up by small arms fire." So the Army in general was replaced by the Marine colonel. That's quite a rebuke, and the colonel called his officers and said, "I will have that airport by noon, or you will be replaced by Marines." Needless to say, the Marines took it, and another considerable amount of ground, so that we had Jap defenses on the run. The next morning I was standing on a hill, following the progress of Marines over the airport, and then turned northward. About that time a piece of steel fragment fell from the sky and struck me right on the chest. I was a little stunned, but also laughed about it. When I bent down to pick it up, it was too hot to hold, so I dropped it. I carried it for quite a while, and finally lost it. But it was like a gentle reminder of where I was and what I was doing. A Christmas Crisis, Guadalcanal, December 1942. My first Christmas away from home found me in the front lines on Guadalcanal. Our initial invasion had been successful, but we were busy securing our lines and preparing ourselves for any counterattack the enemy might attempt. The Japanese had been caught by surprise and withdrew back into the mountains to lick their wounds and to prepare another surprise attack that might push us back into the ocean. But the Christmas season had to be set aside to another day, for we had hard work ahead of us. For us, Christmas would just be another day of digging on the south side of the Metanao River, which would make an immense barrier for any planned attack by the enemy. Our first task was to create bridges across the river so that we would be prepared to attack and go beyond the river in pursuit of the enemy, depending how the battle waged. Now, it is a little difficult to prepare for a murderous battle and think about Christmas at the same time. Outwardly, we were prepared to kill as many of the enemy that we could, but inwardly, every man could not help saying, "This is really strange. Where is the tinsel? Where is the snow? Where are the wreaths? And why are we so low?" About that time, a military truck pulled into our bivouac and began to pass out Christmas presents to every man on the line. You talk about joy. You talk about ridiculous false beards. Even on the Woman's Salvation Army gal, passing out packages that enclosed things like clean socks, underwear, gloves, candy, and a toothpaste and toothbrushes, and all the last things you would expect to find in the jungle. Suddenly we were not alone. These were God's messengers from America, telling us that we were not alone. We were not forgotten or overlooked. How in the world those civilians got out here, I will never know. But just like Santa Claus, they appeared, dropped their presents and their love, and then just swept away to the next Marine with their gifts and encouragement. And believe me, more than one Marine had a little lump in his throat that day. What we didn't know was that Guadalcanal was just the beginning. After a 6-month struggle, we secured the island. We were taken down to New Zealand, where we trained and received replacements for about 5 months, and then it was on to Tarawa, an island 2 miles long and half that wide, which Japan had prepared only to slow our forces down. We were moved to the big island of Hawaii, where we wintered. Yes, wintered, for it snowed, but we only had tents to sleep in. Then on to Saipan, an island that was about 8 miles long and 4 miles wide, and then on to Tinian, just a little smaller but brutal to the end. After Tinian, we were sitting around a fire one night, trying to remember who had been wounded and who were yet alive. We had left the States with 300 men, and of those 300, only 10 remained. After each battle, we had to get replacements, but of the original 300, we were down to 10. This may sound like a strange Christmas letter, but being home for Christmas, away from home and family, living in a tent, makes Christmas like the frosting on the cake. And I like to remember it because it makes me feel like I am 18 all over again. Kenneth. 4 days of carnage. Actually, I was more of a spectator than I was a participant, and that is probably why I'm still alive to talk about it. When I finished boot camp, I was assigned to a regimental weapons company, which was usually used in support of an infantry unit. We were equipped with 37mm anti-tank guns, 75mm half-track, 50 caliber machine guns, and bazookas. However, we were also equipped with rifles and the other equipment of an infantry unit, and occasionally we would be called on to support or relieve an infantry unit, so we had to be trained to do both. But we were never called upon to be the first wave in a landing or in a field attack. But what we did have on Tarawa was ringside seats to one of the bloodiest, defective, but glorious landings in military history. 3 days out of Tarawa, we were told where we were going and what we should expect in this landing. Compared to our 6 months on Guadalcanal, it seemed like a gentle training landing. After all, it was only 2.5 miles long, 800 yards wide, completely flat so you could see from one end to the other, and the Japs had only occupied it from September of 42, just a little over a year. We were told there was about 4,000 Imperial Marines and 4,000 Korean laborers there, and we were going to hit them with 20,000 Marines, 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers with 2 minesweepers, and the Air Force was going to hit them with 500-pound bombs before we went in. All these cheerful statistics led us to violate the first rule of warfare. Never underestimate the power of your enemy. Another rule we should have considered was never believe in all your intelligence. Our intelligence was sketchy, and in particular, we knew nothing about the vagaries of the tide, and that cost us hundreds of unnecessary lives. 2 other intelligence facts were unknown. Later, we learned that the engineer who designed and built the fortifications was a genius. Military experts later said that Tarawa was the most heavily fortified piece of ground in the world, and they boasted it would take 1 million men to take Tarawa. Later, I watched the 16-inch projectiles from the battleships ricochet off the bunkers with no effect, and so many bombs and other projectiles had hit the island that the palm trees looked like they had been trimmed by a giant mower. Secondly, we did not comprehend the tenacity of the Japanese forces. We thought that after 1 day of bombardment, they would surrender, and surely not fight right down to the last man, even committing suicide before they would consider surrendering. But their orders were to stand and fight regardless of the situation, never surrender. We were told afterwards that only 12 Jap soldiers were captured, and that it was because they were wounded. Some escaped to a nearby island, but later routed out by the occupying troops. When the dawn of D-Day broke, it revealed a line of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other craft and planes, tearing up the morning sky with their onslaught of tiny Tarawa. I had never seen up close what those powerful ships could do. They were close enough in that we could not only see them fire, but watch the tracer effect of the projectile streak over and hit its target. What was unnerving was that often the shell just bounced off the bunker and went screaming up into the sky. But on November 20th, 1943, the troops had disembarked into the dark and were in the Higgins boats and Amtraks and began their assault when it was light and when the naval bombardment eased off. But it didn't take long for us to see that there was a serious problem with the boats. The tide had gone down and the boats got hung up on the reef and could go no further, meaning that the troops had to get out and walk towards shore, anywhere from 800 to 500 yards away, and in the water only up to their knees, so that they were exposed to the hellish machine gun fire coming from the shore emplacements. The Amtraks were able to crawl over the reef, but then they became targets of the 5-inch naval guns, so that regularly you could see an Amtrak blow up and be consumed by flames, and to be left like a gravestone in the deadly reef. I had a pair of field glasses, and I watched the carnage as long as I could, and then I would hand them to somebody else, and they in turn would become sickened by what was happening. It was in no time at all before the water was speckled by the fallen bodies of our men, and it made us wonder if anyone was making it ashore. It began to be apparent that all of our bombardment was virtually ineffective. The Japs had just buttoned up in their bunkers and pillboxes until the Navy let up so the troops could go in. Then they remanned all their shoreline pillboxes and even the machine gun nests alongside the pier that stuck out 500 yards from the shorelines, giving them excellent flank position to pick up the slow-moving troops as they made their way to shore. I have never felt so helpless in my life as I watched those gutty Marines just keep forging ahead. Every report that we got was disastrous. We even heard that so many radio men had been knocked out that they had lost contact with the ships that were needed to support their advance. It got so bad I could not watch it anymore. I went below and into the head and cried like a baby. I didn't want anyone to see me crying, but I knew there were other regimental weapons platoons that were attached to the infantry platoons were now probably ashore, and with their heavy weapons they were probably prime targets. I prayed for them and for the troops that were ashore. I didn't know what else I could do. That second day, I knew what I could do. Our platoon sergeant, John Smith, told us that they were asking for volunteers to take radio equipment ashore. Evidently, the Japs had been told to single out anyone with a radio on his back as a target, just as they had been instructed to take out anyone who was obviously leading any attacks, for they knew radio men were the key to ship-to-shore fire, and leaderless units soon dispersed and were without direction. I was a corporal at the time, and I felt the responsibility to set an example. So I immediately said, "I'll go," and Smitty said, "Check with your squad to see if they want to go with you." I can no longer remember exactly how many said yes, but it was around 8 to 10 men. Each man was to carry a radio and go armed with his rifle. By 1400, we were in a Higgins boat heading for the end of the pier because there was no sure way we could get to the beach. The coxswain dropped the ramp on the end of the pier, and we raced out to the pier behind a huge pile of supplies that had collected there. I remember turning around and watching the coxswain back his boat away from the pier, crouching behind his armored steering wheel for at least 100 yards before he felt it was safe to turn back to the ship. We watched him, wondering if he would ever see him again, and secretly wondering why we had been such damn fools to volunteer for this. One thing for sure, we were not going to deliver any radios that afternoon. We had machine gun firing all around us, and I ordered my men to stay flat and not even attempt to look around the side or the top of that pile of supplies, for their firing was obviously for the purpose of pinning us down, for we had no way to go except over the top or in the water, and either would be suicide. I decided that we would wait till the firing lit up or it got dark, so we would have some chance of getting ashore with our radio equipment. Occasionally, I would try to peer around the pile to locate the source of the firing against us. When I turned back, I was upset by the fact that one of my eager beaver men was peeking his head around with me as well, and I really gave him hell. I yelled, "Get your damn head back in there. I will do the looking, and you do the ducking, and I will tell you when it's time to go." I learned on Guadalcanal that a bullet sounds different when you're in front of it rather than behind it. When you're behind it, like when you are on the range firing, it's just one big bam. But when it's coming at you, it has a high cracking sound, and when you hear it, it is too late to duck. It has already gone past you. And that is what I was hearing when I had to stick my head out. And every time I heard it, it made me just sick with fear. When I looked back at my men cowering in fear on the end of the pier, I realized that it would be an easy shot for a Jap mortarman to drop one on the end of the pier and take us out with one shot. We were, after all, only 500 yards off the beach, and we had no way of digging in. We obviously did not have the luxury of a safe way to the beach. About that time, I began to wonder why that coxswain had dropped us here rather than make a run for the beach. Actually, there were no good options for us, any more than those poor brave bastards that floated in the water all around us. About that time, I looked around, and to my amazement, the coxswain had returned with the boat, dropped his ramp on the edge of the pier, so we could all scramble aboard. I don't know whether he had orders to return, or whether he had made the decision all alone to come back and get us out of a bad spot. We had been there around 45 minutes, so maybe he had a bad conscience about it, not taking us to the beach. But it did not take my people long to get aboard, and hoped to get back to the ship. What I didn't know till later was that the Japs had also installed machine guns all along the sides of the pier, and had we opted for going into the water after it got dark, we would have faced some serious firepower and probably would have all been killed. just so we could provide our troops with better communications. When we got back on the ship, I noticed that my men were quiet, withdrawn, as though they had failed their comrades ashore, and I experienced similar feelings. But the longer I dwelt on it, the madder I got. If anyone should feel ashamed, it was those who failed to provide us with the intelligence about the most fortified piece of ground in the world. It could easily been bypassed and rendered useless by regular air raids and shelling. There were plenty of atolls nearby that we could have built a similar strip on. We played right into the hands of the Japs, for they were ready to sacrifice their troops if only they could delay and divert us from our ultimate goal of preparing their homeland for invasion. While I love the Marine Corps, I have noticed that all too often they are rigid in their battle plans. They are too dependent upon mass landings, taking the high ground regardless of the cost in lives. When we glory in our casualties, we have lost sight of the value of every man who has had to lay down his life for a piece of ground. The failure to study the tides was also slipshod intelligence. Submarines and other surface vessels could easily have measured the depth and times of the tides. Perhaps half of our casualties was caused by a low tide that left troops walking on the reef in knee-deep water, 500 to 800 yards from shore. They were duck soup to the beach emplacements. What was inexcusable was ordering the landing to commence. When they knew in advance that the tide was down, they knew what the men would face, but they sent them anyway. And even if they didn't know till the first wave went in, the second wave and all to follow should have been delayed and renewed once the tides were in our favor. After all, the Japs weren't going anywhere, and all our bombardment by planes and ships in advance meant that we were not going to surprise them. No, once again, when the Marines start a landing, they do not stop it until the last man is dead. That is like a man driving a nail in with a hammer who misses and hits his thumb, but just keeps on hitting the thumb once he has started. He thinks it would be stupid to stop. I know the brass will say, what does a 20-year-old corporal know about landings? Do you know how much planning, etc. goes into such an operation? I know it is easy to criticize after the fact, but the brass is going to have to learn to be more flexible. The great military leaders always have alternate plans and are able to make changes in the midst of battle. In fact, that is what makes them great, and I think that we did not have concerned leadership in Tarawa. They were more concerned with their reputations than they were with the lives of their men, for they spent us as though we were expendable, and since Tarawa, they will crow about their victory there. But that was no victory. It was butchery, perpetrated by narrow-minded militants, and the men that survived it were not jubilant or ecstatic in their survival, but rather were somber, disbelieving, and heartbroken at the high cost of their battle. When the coxswain returned us to our ship, the USS William P. Biddle, it was loaded with the wounded and what was left of our regiment. I was told our regiment went to Tarawa on 3 ships, and what was left of us, including the wounded, left on Tarawa on just 1 ship. The sick bays were all filled with the seriously wounded, and the deck was filled with the walking wounded. The mood was tearful as we learned little by little who didn't make it, and how badly wounded the others were. Thanksgiving Day came after we left Tarawa, and the PA system instructed all able-bodied men to go to the mess and get a tray full of food to take topside and feed the walking wounded who needed help. I did that 3 times before I got to eat myself. The chaplain came over the PA system and led us in a Thanksgiving prayer, and all over the ship you could see men weeping and comforting one another. It took us 5 days to get back to Hawaii, and those were hard days. It was like a 5-day funeral for the good men we had lost. Let us pray that we will never have to perpetrate that scene again. Those who think that Tarawa was a victory, go back to its barren beach and count the white crosses that now smother the island from one end to the other. And remember, those crosses do not include the dead Japanese soldiers who thought they were giving their lives for their country too. Tarawa, November 1943. Dear family, November 12th, 1993. I just got a nice letter from Gene. He sent me an article about the Battle of Tarawa that was in his Retired Officers magazine. The article describes the bitterness of that battle and enormous casualties, and that concluded that it was not even necessary, that it could have been bypassed. I have heard several sources give the statistics of that battle, and I think they were modified at home. The article said that 1,000 were killed and 2,000 wounded out of 18,600 committed in that battle. What I do know is that the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment of the 2nd Division was the first wave, and almost totally obliterated, and that the 2nd Regiment, which was the first to land, had 80% casualties and 90% casualties in their officers. We went to Tarawa on 4 large troop ships, and what was left of us, including the wounded, left on 1 troop ship. I have 2 vivid memories of Tarawa. In most situations of combat, you have times of rest and reprieve from the firefights. But from the day I landed at 1400 hours on the 2nd day of the battle till the 4th day, we were finally sent back to the ships. It was just one unrelenting experience of stark fear with little or no sleep, since the Japanese were everywhere and hardly any time to eat, let alone an appetite, and little or no organization or direction, since most of our leadership had been killed, and bodies everywhere, rotting in the sun. There was no way that you could ever prepare men to fight this way. It was every man for himself, and if you survived, you knew it was by nothing else but God's mercy. My second unforgettable memory is the irrepressible depression of going back aboard ship with the walking wounded everywhere. We celebrated Thanksgiving by getting in a long mess line, getting a tray of food, and going back topside to feed it to a wounded Marine who could not walk through the line or feed himself. I went through the line 4 times. It did not feel like we had won a victory. We sat around and talked dejectedly about the good men we had lost, and while not saying it out loud, I'm sure we all wondered if it was really worth it. Thanksgiving night I went topside, curled up under a Higgins boat, and cried myself to sleep. I never come to a Thanksgiving season without remembering that one. We all knew we had a lot to be thankful for. To come off that island without a scratch was like a miracle. The chaplain's Thanksgiving service was well attended indeed, and certain sobriety continued to hang over the regiment after we disembarked on the large island of Hawaii and set up camp in the high country near a cattle ranch. It was not until the new replacements from the States arrived a couple of months later that we got our old spirit back again. Of course, they hadn't seen any combat yet, so were full of fun and that old cocky Marine confidence that is so infectious. When you are young and inexperienced, you never think of dying. You think everybody else dies, but not you. But after Tarawa, I knew that the odds against me of getting home alive and would get more and more slim as we trained and prepared for one more landing, which would be Saipan and Tinian. All that seems just like yesterday. I don't care how senile I get as I age. I know I will never forget those life and death days, which at times seem glorious and other times seem like ultimate idiocy. I see what you did by sending me that article, Gene. You pulled my string and off I go on a tangent of old memories. But it is good to remember the deliverance of God. The psalmist says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever." Dear Mr. President, I am a veteran of World War II. The day after Pearl Harbor, I left my last high school class and took a streetcar downtown so that I could enlist in the Marine Corps. My father, who was a veteran of World War I, also left his work on Monday to enlist, even though he was then 47 years old. We rode the train together to boot camp in San Diego, but my father was deprived the right to experience actual combat, but he trained new recruits in the Chicago boot camp. But I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, and after a few months was put aboard a troop ship that was headed for combat. I made the landing on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Tanaboga, and the Big Island of Florida. The specialty of my regiment weapons led me to regular patrols to destroy hidden Jap listening posts. The success of these patrols was to deny any communication to the Jap airstrips just north of us. After 6 months, we were relieved by the Army and sent to New Zealand for a rest and retraining to retake the islands that Japan had occupied. After about 5 months, we were sent to retake Tarawa. No one would ever give us any straight figures, but the overflights estimated that the Japs had about 4,000 troops on the island, which was only 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, and every beach was alive with anti-boat guns, for they had been told that they were merely bait, and their task was to kill as many as they could to deplete future numbers. No one ever gave us any dependable figures, but they fought to the death, and the scuttlebutt said that only 12 Japs were left. The troop ships that took us to the Big Island of Hawaii were loaded with our bandaged, walking wounded, and I don't know how many more in the ship's hospital. I slept on the steel deck under a landing craft to keep out of the rain. The Big Island of Hawaii really looked good to us by the time that we arrived. A tent city was erected for the 2nd Division with 8 men to a tent and mess halls ready to meet our horrendous horrendous appetites. But we were surprised to find that the warmth of Hawaii was strictly near the beach. Once at the 5,000-foot altitude of our prepared camp, it was winterish, and we slept under several blankets and had little heaters in the center of the tent. We trained by making 13-mile hikes down to the ocean again and back with a full pack. If we were expecting a rest, we had to forget it. It was obvious that we were pre-preparing for another landing, and that was confirmed by the way that we started getting new recruits in to replace our former wounded and dead. I made corporal with 2 stripes and received a huge salary raise with nowhere to spend it. What the stripes did was to understand that I had the responsibility of 3 men under me and directly responsible to my sergeant, who was also over another 2 such fighting units. To my knowledge, there was no liberty of any kind, just immediate preparation for the next landing, wherever that might be. Later, we would find out that it would be the big island of Saipan and the smaller island just south of it, Tinian. The Japs had occupied these 2 large islands for many years and had 2 impressive airstrips to their credit. That would make it much more difficult for any further assaults. But after just 5 months, our casualties had been replaced by new and untried replacements, that we would have little time to train them. But after 5 short months, we were ordered back aboard ship for further training. But actually, we were on our way to Saipan, ready or not, green troop and all. We reboarded our transport, and this time the veterans had to train the rookies. It was apparent to me this time we were just not as cocky, confident, or eager to lay our lives on the line again. After all, we had wrestled the Japs for 6 months on Guadalcanal and Tulogi, and then experienced horrendous casualties taking the little island Tarawa. And although we had received some fresh troops to replace our losses, the main forces that had gone through 2 major campaigns were expected to suffer even more without respite, and the spirit of the veterans was less than happy. The old-timers tried to hide their apprehension by slogans like, "Hell no, I won't go," and there was a noticeable lack of enthusiasm about the prospect of an even larger landing operation that was not as docile and was supported by over 300 Jap planes that were ordered to perform kamikaze, suicidal attacks on our ships when we approached for a landing. After a shipboard review of what the landing would be like, I noticed a definite depression in my comrades who were no longer rookies or excited about such a huge landing that was to be much more devastating than any we had done before, and in the proximity of Japan itself, which we knew would hit us with everything they had to keep Saipan, for the next step would be Japan itself. And that is what it was. For once we had secured Saipan, we immediately made an airstrip that enabled our planes to land and attack Japan, which led to their demise. My experience had taught me that the more you are exposed to warfare, the more you are likely to be killed, and we were preparing to die. And believe it or not, my youthful enthusiasm for being a Marine had forbid me to even think about dying. But suddenly, I knew that my death was very possible and even probable. I found myself withdrawing from my comrades and seeking somewhere I could go pray. The dread of death hung over my heart like it had already begun to decay. I could find no place to pray or anyone to pray with because I didn't want to reveal my awful sense of desolation. There is little or no privacy on a ship with 2,000 Marines aboard, so I fled to the upper deck where we were not supposed to be and where they stored the large landing craft, and finally such a privacy under one of the landing craft where I began to weep and pray and pled with God that I would not be killed. As I think back upon it, I wonder how other men faced the real possibility that in just a few days they would be thrust into a small landing craft which would thrust them onto a strange shore where the odds for living would be slim to none. I am sure that I was not alone in that prayer. But as I sought for words to pray, my heart and mind went back to those prayer meetings we used to have in Boone's church and many of the prayer warriors that were in that godly congregation, and I began to cry and pray and call out to God, for I knew that just in front of my landing craft there would be a hail of fire that only God could control. And I prayed that He save my life and deliver me from all that Holocaust, and He did. God did not ever leave me. He still answers my prayers, keeps me well, fills me with joy, keeps His promises, and has a place for me in heaven when I die. Who is richer than the man or woman who personally knows and keeps the promises of a living God? I think that I started this letter addressed to Mr. President because I intended to mail it to him, but it's far more important for me to write to you, my children, my relatives, and my beloved Rosa. My God had provided me with riches untold, and I refer you to Him in every trial of life. He will never leave you or forsake you. October 19th, 2000. Department of Veteran Affairs, Phoenix, Arizona. To the 345th Team, 2nd Battalion, 9th Company, Sergeant Kempton. Gentlemen, I have previously applied to ask that I be fitted with hearing aids as a service-connected request. You in turn wrote back asking that we verify the loss of hearing by a doctor's letter, which I am including. I will also hope to detail the circumstances that led to this loss. I joined the Marine Corps on February 23rd of 1942 and proceeded to go to San Diego for boot camp. My first exposure to damaging sounds was on the firing line while training to fire our .30 caliber rifles. The only thing that mitigated the sharp sounds of 50 rifles going off at once was a little cotton in our ears. But still, at the end of the day, many of us still had ringing in our ears and could not hear well. By August 7th, we were landing at Guadalcanal, Tulogi, and Tanabogo, and the rifle fire was now accentuated by the 8-inch guns of our cruisers, bombs dropping, and in general, one hell of a noise for 3 straight days while we were taking the islands. For a while, we were dug in near the airport to protect it from being retaken. One night, a Japanese battleship cruised into the harbor and for 4 hours pinned us down with 14-inch guns. One of my closest friends cracked up that night from the noise and the impact of being knocked around in a foxhole that you did not dare get out of. My ears rang for several weeks after that. My regiment was on Guadalcanal for 6 months, and we were regularly called upon to relieve another unit on the lines, and then the noise would begin all over again. When Guadalcanal was secured, we were taken to New Zealand for rest and more training. There, we went up into the mountains and trained by firing our 50 caliber machine guns and 75 millimeter guns mounted on half tracks. Firing of weapons was just the order of the day. We next landed on Tarawa, which was a small atoll just 2 miles long and about 800 miles wide. Our cruisers covered our landing with 16-inch guns from our battleships and 8-inch guns from the cruisers. There was no place on that island that you could escape the pervasive explosions. We did most of our talking with arm and hand signals. My regiment went to Tarawa on 4 large troop ships, but all that was left of us, including walking wounded, left on 1 large troop ship. We were taken to the large island of Hawaii, where we trained near the volcano for 5 months. It was while we were on a training mission that I received the most damage to my ears. I was in charge of a half-track that had a 75 millimeter gun on it, and we had been firing at targets. We were ordered to cease fire so that we could check our targets. I got out of the half-track and walked forward so that I could get a good view with my binoculars, and as I was standing even with the barrel of that 75 millimeter gun, one of my men accidentally fired that gun. The sound nearly knocked me down. I could not hear out of either ear for over 3 weeks. In those days, a little thing like deafness was not considered to be a wound or a reason for not being ready for battle. Besides, I was just too proud to admit how badly my ears hurt and how humiliating it was to not be able to hear what the others did. 5 months later, we landed on Saipan. For 27 days, we marched up that island, and almost every night we would have a counterattack, preceded by a barrage of mortars just before they stormed our lines. When they did, my entire platoon of 47 men would be firing just as fast as they could to stem the tide. No one did much talking after it got to be daylight, and even then it would be 9 or 10 o'clock before anyone said much of anything, because their ears would still be ringing from the counterattack. We also landed on Tinian after that, but it was only an 11-day campaign, and by that time I had 27 months overseas. So once we secured the island, I was sent home. I took a piece of shrapnel in my chest on Saipan, but since it was not a disabling wound, I stayed with my men on the lines. Then on Tinian, I took a small piece of shrapnel in my left arm. Neither were crippling, but just made nice reminders of where I'd been. I've always had hearing problems, but when I was young and attractive, I just laughed it off and would say, "Huh?" or "What's that?" forcing those around me to repeat twice what they had to say. But as I grow older, I'm not quite as willing to put up with that handicap. I am not too proud to wear a hearing aid now, and I know there are a lot of wonderful things I am not able to hear, like bird singing, the wind whistling through the trees, and the voices of my children or grandchild. I did go to a miracle ear facility where they confirmed also that I badly needed a hearing aid. However, I am just not able to afford a $2,000 hearing aid. I have a friend my age who is also a veteran but never left the States or saw any combat. He recently applied for hearing aids in Arkansas where he lives, and he had no trouble getting them. He encouraged me to apply, so I am doing that. I now live on my Social Security check, which for my wife and I amounts to $1,906 a month. I do have a small nest egg, but once you are 77 years old, you husband that in the event your health begins to fail and you need it for either yourself or your wife. I apologize for the long letter, but you seem to be asking me to give you all the details on my hearing loss, so that's what I have done. The reason the letter from the doctor is a copy is that the original copy he sent me was lost, so I had to go to his office to ask him to supply me with a copy, which he did. I am sure that you'll want to verify the letter. You can call his office and they will validate it. If there is anything else you need from me, please let me know. Respectfully yours, Kenneth Kempton. P.S. I am also enclosing copies of my original physical exam, which indicates that I had normal hearing when I enlisted on February 23, 1942, then 2 copies when I left the service indicating I had damage in my right ear.